Genshiken, Lucky Star, Ore-imo, Comic Party, Dojin Work, and a number of other series. Way too many to count. A lot of shows just doing maybe a little one-off thing here or there. But the thing all these shows have in common is that they prominently feature Tokyo Big Sight, just framed on the screen for a couple seconds, and it just pans over it, and that's all the introduction the fans watching the show need to know exactly what's going on. It doesn't matter what they call it. A lot of shows, they might call it something different, like Comic Festival or something like that. But in our hearts, we all know that they're referring to the one and the only Comiket or Comic Market. I've been dreaming about going to Comiket for so many years now at this point. It's like I've fulfilled my destiny as an otaku. And so many years ago, I was watching videos by random people online, namely Original Ren, and I believe he did a couple of vlogs of Comiket and stuff, and I always thought how cool it was that a gaijin could make it over there and like actually go to Comiket and buy doujinshi and be involved with this thing that I, as a fan overseas, only saw as something that was so far away and only can be depicted in the anime and the manga and stuff we saw, and we weren't really engaging fully with the community. That was until this year. Last year was the first time I went to Japan, technically in 2023 also, but it was a beginning of January 2023. But this year I went back for the sole purpose of going to Comiket, which was the biggest regret I have from the trip last year, was that I ended up missing Comiket. This year I said, screw it, I'm going all in. I'm putting everything on the line now, and I ended up paying extra for plane tickets, extra for Airbnb, specifically because it was over New Year's, because it's not just because of Comiket, it's because of New Year's. But anyways, I'm going to give a little retrospective thoughts about visiting Comiket, going to Comiket, participating as a shopper, and just some general thoughts and stuff about it. I guess the most important thing to note prior to starting this discussion properly is to say that during the first part of my trip, I was in Tokyo, specifically in Nakano. The Airbnb I stayed in was an apartment that was kind of sometimes you luck out with an Airbnb, sometimes you don't, and you get like a cheap place. Over New Year's, a lot of places were marked up significantly more than they were last year. So this was like a one-bedroom apartment with probably one of the worst bathrooms I've stayed in. And of course, I ended up paying more than I did last year when I stayed near Akasaka. But the point was, I stayed near Nakano, and it was incredibly convenient due to the amount of food in the area, plus Nakano Broadway was nearby, and to that extent, the Nakano station was right there. So it was a pretty quick walk, which was good. So I ended up waking up not super early for the event. I was kind of torn on how early I should get there, since nowadays it's more ticket-based, and I didn't want to end up waiting in line for super long. Plus, the weather wasn't going to be as compliant that day. There was a little bit of rain on the radar, so I didn't want to be standing in the rain for like 3 hours. So I ended up waking up around 6:15 or 6:30 in the morning, got ready, got dressed, and I picked up some food from Family Mart prior to going to the station. Luckily, the Airbnb I stayed in provided an umbrella, otherwise I would have had to buy one from Family Mart. At Family Mart, I picked up nothing too fancy. I picked up katsu sandwich, onigiri, and 2 bottles of Itoen green tea, which would be my nutrition for the day. And that just brings me to the first advice I'm going to give. I'm not going to be like super big on advice for Comiket, but the big thing, especially for Fuyukomi, is to, number one, wear layers. That ended up saving me a lot, because if you wear layers, then you can easily shed stuff, put them into a backpack, which you should definitely bring. And of course, remember to bring plenty of food and water specifically, that there are plenty of vending machines in the venue, but I didn't look at them. I'm assuming they're a little bit more expensive, not price gouging too much. Pick up food or water prior to getting to the event, because the first thing you will notice once getting out of the station at the event is that the Lawson's there is completely packed, and you have zero chance of buying anything pretty much. And I mentioned that food and water specifically because you will dehydrate yourself and you will pass out. I ended up walking about 10 miles. The Itoen green tea saved me a lot, as well as the katsu sandwich. It wasn't nearly enough. I kind of wish I got a little bit more, but that's what it was. From Nakano Station, I started to head towards the Tokyo Big Sight. Well, I initially took a connecting line from Nakano to, I believe it was Shinjuku, and from there I wasn't supposed to take a limited express line from Shinjuku to the Kokusai Tenjijo station, but I ended up taking a regular line. I ended up hopping off, getting back onto the proper limited express, and the way that you know the correct train to get on to go to Comiket is if the train is fucking packed. It will increasingly get more packed the closer you get to the event, but it's pretty obvious that at 7 o'clock in the morning on January 31st that the train with all the people on it was the one that would be taking me to Tokyo Big Sight. So it was a little uncomfortable after a while. Like, it was pretty packed. I've never been on a train in Japan that's been that packed, even during rush hour on normal lines and stuff like that. It was like zero amount of wiggle room, 2 hands above the head. I'm not going to be a Chikan. And it was pretty crazy. The door would open, someone would like look in and be like, screw it, I'm going in, guys, and then just adds another person, and somehow space will appear. That's like the most interesting thing about this, is like, if you're in a train and it's packed, more people can get on, some people will move, and then more space will just miraculously appear. But it was an incredibly packed train, and it was not fun at all, but and it was a decent ride away. It was like a half hour, maybe at least it felt that long. Finally, we made it to Kokusai Tenjiro Station, and it was immediately apparent that this was Comiket for sure. The line started the second you got off the train. Luckily, staff was there and had everybody in control. This was probably the biggest thing I noted from being at Comiket, how well staffed in general Comiket was, and how well they had everything under control, that they were just like moving people along, there was a huge sea of people getting off trains and stuff. They were just routing everybody out of the station so efficiently that, like, despite a significant amount of foot traffic, the lines were just moving, and it was good. So I ended up sort of following the flow of people towards the general direction of Tokyo Big Sight. In my head, I kind of knew where I needed to go, but at the same time, I didn't. But walking up to Tokyo Big Sight, there was a little drizzle going on, and the only thing I could think of as the Tokyo Big Sight building came into view was, I better not slip on the stairs and break my wrist. In that moment, I was just making a conscious effort to firmly plant my foot on every single step, because I knew that it would only happen to me, that I would break my wrist falling down the stairs, like feet away from entering Comiket.
Oh. Yeah.
恥ずかしいやつめ。
伝説になりそうですね。
From there began the battle to enter the correct area. For Comiket, after, I think, was it C100 or C101, when they started to implement the new ticketing system. So basically, there are different tiers for ticketing. I don't believe you can enter for free anymore. So it's all tickets/wristbands now. So you can enter a lottery for an early admission, which allows you to get into the convention halls at 10:30 as opposed to 11 o'clock when it opens up normally. You can enter at 11 with a wristband. I believe it's like 1,500 yen or 12. I think it's 1,200 actually. And then I believe there is a PM one. I didn't look into that because I was not interested in entering in the PM, but I don't think it's free anymore. Whereas prior, it used to be free. You would think that charging people to enter the venue would somewhat decrease the amount of participants, but it did not. Despite that, this was the largest number of people I've ever seen in my life in one place. It was kind of ridiculous. Regarding the ticketing, there were 2 different lotteries for tickets that I entered, at least the 2 main ones that I was interested in. I believe one of them was Higashi entrance and the other one was the Nishi Minami entrance. I ended up actually winning the lottery and I got the Nishi Minami entrance wristband. I didn't realize it until after the fact, but this was actually the entrance for the industry area, which I was not very interested in at all. But I figured that regardless, I would want to have the early admission to at least get 30 minutes extra to wander around. So I ended up paying the 550 yen, I believe it was, for the early admission wristband and headed towards where I was. So I wasn't exactly sure where the Nishi Minami entrance was. There was a map that you could look at on the Comiket website, English and Japanese. But looking at it, it wasn't super clear on where I needed to go. And there was a lot of like entrances that you could have gone into. But luckily, there was plenty of staff, like I mentioned before. I asked the dude, and he pointed me in the right direction. Though it is worth noting that there is a couple other gaijin that you can clearly tell that it was also their first time going to Comiket. And I noticed that there was a dude following me, and he ended up lining up in the same area. It was obviously kind of funny, and I guess I'll mention it now since it's the perfect time to mention it. Like, there's not too many other gaijin there, but you will run into each other, and you will make eye contact, and in that moment, you're like, should I nod at this dude? Should I tell him something? Like, we're both out here, man. We're both out here at Comiket. We're both comrades, brothers in arms out here. Should I talk to this guy or what? I'm also going to take the opportunity now to shout out a YouTube channel called Comiket Ski that does vlogs for Comiket, and I watched a couple of his prior to going myself, so I had a general idea of what to expect. But even if you don't do any research whatsoever, you don't look at any maps, a lot of stuff, there is signage for it. Might not be 100% clear, but you can always ask staff there. Not sure about their ability to understand English. I spoke Japanese to them, or you might be able to generally communicate with them if you don't speak any Japanese. And on that note, I didn't notice anything stopping you from going into any other entrance as long as you had a wristband, at least an early one. So I had an early wristband for the Nishiminami entrance by the industry area. However, it seemed as though everybody else had a pink wristband that said early admission on it. There was nothing that said industry area, and there was nothing on it that said it had to specifically be this entrance. So even if you won for a specific area, it was mostly up to an honor system that you would actually go line up in that area. I probably could have gone to the Higashi entrance where I actually wanted to go for the Dojinshi. I guess it's up to you at that point. Judge it as you will. No one will actually take the time to wristband check you. There are certain sections where they'll tell you to raise your hand where you have your wristband. You'll walk by, they'll just kind of glance at you. But as far as I'm aware, everybody who had an early wristband, theirs was pink, so you probably could get away with it. So I ended up actually starting to line up around 9 or 9:30, and I ended up just basically standing in line, and that's the unfortunate truth for Comiket. You're going to be in line for a while just waiting to get in. It's going to feel like forever. There was a bit of rain. Luckily, I brought my umbrella.
この悪天候、イベントって感じがするだろう。こういう時こそ宗教体験とかするんだぜ、きっと。
But the rain did eventually let up. The sun came out. The weather did get a little bit warmer, but you're near the coast, so you will get a decent amount of wind, and it will be chillier than it is in central Tokyo. And also, it was super hype because, like, it started to rain. This is when we're all waiting in line. And there was this dude, like, standing a couple rows over from me. And he pulled out a Kamiya Now umbrella from Idolmaster. And, like, this was the most hype moment in the morning for me prior to entering the event itself. And this dude was, like, completely dripped out in Idolmaster merch. He had an Idolmaster hoodie, an Idolmaster shirt, and an Idolmaster bag. And then he pulls out the umbrella. He opens it up, and you just see Kamiya Now on it. And you're like, dude, we're here, man. We're here. This dude bought this novelty umbrella specifically for this moment. All our lives have been leading up to this single moment right now. It's amazing. Eventually, there's a dude who starts walking around with a megaphone. I didn't really understand anything he was saying. And this is just like a general thing for when visiting Japan, at least for me. I'm not fluent. I'm somewhat conversational. I'm okay. But you got to remember that no matter how fluent you are, nothing will save you when it comes to trying to comprehend some people. Even like if you were listening to someone on a megaphone in English, it would be kind of difficult to make out what they're saying because they talk loud. The megaphone distorts their voice, and it makes it seem like everything they're saying is just like this blob of words. He probably was saying important stuff, but just kind of follow everybody else and you'll be fine. Eventually, they started to let people in around 10:30, and this was when I started to speed walk through the industry area, picking up a couple flyers and random clear files and stuff they were handing out along the way. But my main goal was to make it to, I believe it was the Nishiha area where the Toho area was. So there were different entrances that led to different parts of the convention. And I guess this is the part where I'm going to talk about the actual venue of Comiket because it's remarkably large. Like, you don't actually know how big the Comiket venue is until you actually get there and realize that it's this sprawling labyrinth underneath the Tokyo Big Sight. You know, when you think of Tokyo Big Sight, you think about those, like, triangles on the pillars and stuff, and, like, oh, it's that glass thing, right? No, Comiket takes place completely underneath. There's, like, what I can only describe as like aircraft hangars and dozens of them. It's huge. You don't actually know how big Comiket is until you go there, and then you realize that to make it from one end of the convention hall to the other end of the convention hall, you literally have to walk like a half mile. It's kind of insane. I didn't really note too much in the industry area, though mostly it was like video games. There was a couple of like modern eroge stuff in there, but I kind of just zoomed by. But my area sort of connected into the rest of everything, so I was able to get through. I started to make my way to the exit. Staff were initially blockading passages between the areas, so you couldn't immediately make it into the next hallway and go down the escalators and stuff. For maybe like 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes, not too much. And then after that, it was mostly like trying to navigate to get to where I was actually going. And even though it was pretty early and it was only the early admission people, there was a significant amount of foot traffic. And I didn't even know this many otaku existed, let alone like be into this thing. And to know the fact that this amount of people only represented a small fraction of the otaku community, not just in Japan, but worldwide, is kind of staggering. And like I mentioned before, there was other gaijin there, and it was mostly like walking past them and like making eye contact awkwardly and wondering if we should I acknowledge this guy or what. But we definitely stood out. Not that many gaijin as one would expect. It was mostly Japanese natives. Though I did notice, though, however, there was a lot of tourists at Comiket. Well, maybe not a lot, but between gaijin, it was like a 50-50 split between if you would see like a dude with a bag of doujinshi or obvious tourist. I saw that at one point there was this dude, some gaijin, with like a stroller and their kids and their wife. And I was just wondering if they even knew what Comiket was. Because it should be made a little bit more clear that this is not like a wink wink nudge nudge porn convention. It's mostly a porn convention. The vast majority of it, or at least the reason why the majority of people are there, is to buy doujinshi. And the majority of those doujinshi are erotic in nature. There's a little bit more, like there's cosplay stuff and, you know, some other like industry stuff, but that's mostly like a side activity that I guess you can engage with if you want, and you're mostly in the industry area. But the beating heart of Comiket is the doujinshi itself. So it just makes me wonder if people look up Comiket online and they just see it as an anime expo in Japan or something like that. And there was also a gaijin tourist with his girlfriend, which was simply unacceptable. And also something that made me laugh was there was a gaijin with a t-shirt that said something along the lines of Nihongo ga hanasemasu, which is almost a necessity, and that's why I laughed at it. Like, as a little aside, no one will trust your ability to speak Japanese if you don't look Asian. It doesn't matter if you walk up to someone and you start talking fluent in Japanese, there's like a 50-50 chance they're just going to respond in English to you. Doubly so if you don't speak Japanese initially, like you walk up to a counter or something at a restaurant, they might just start speaking broken English to you. So anecdotally, I have a little funny story about Japan. This has nothing to do with Comiket, but I figured I'd mention it right now. So there was a shrine I visited in Kyoto. I wanted to buy an omamori. So I go up to the little counter area. I don't think it's a miko because she wasn't dressed up in like traditional garments or whatever. But it was just whoever the lady was who was manning the little shop there selling omamori. So I go up to the counter and say, Ryoko Anzen omamori onegai shimasu. So she goes to pick up the two different omamori that are applicable for what I asked for, which is Ryoko Anzen, which is vacation safety. There's two different colors. One of them is blue, one of them is purple. And she like holds them up and I say, Murasaki no onegai shimasu. She puts the purple one into a little envelope, hands it to me, looks me dead in the eye and says, 1,000 yen. And this is a microcosm of what you probably will experience in Japan. And I mean like no real ill will to this person or like any Japanese person who might do this instinctively, for all I know that they want to practice their English or like it kind of slipped. But at least entertain the gaijin who walks up to your little shrine and attempts to do something in Japanese. That should be something that you would be like, oh, they're actually making the effort to learn our language. The point is that if you are remotely confident in your ability to speak Japanese, get yourself a shirt that says something along the lines of Nihongo ga hanasemasu, because otherwise no one is going to trust your ability to speak Japanese, and it's going to seem like all the grinding you've ever done on Anki or whatever has been a complete waste. Back to Comiket. The lines and crowds are super intense, but the convention was exceptionally well organized, and there's a lot of volunteers and staff members directing people. And for what it's worth, at least in my experience, I didn't have to wait in line for more than 5 minutes once I was inside. Even for circles on the wall, you ended up standing in line for a brief period of time, take out your phone, and before you know it, they're already moving people over so you can order. Some of the bigger circles on the wall, they had a separate line elsewhere, and you would kind of just find the person holding the sign for the particular circle, and then you would get in back of it, or some of them were like a little bit off to the side, and they had a volunteer from the circle itself moving people over once the current customers were done purchasing their orders. So it was really well organized, be it from the staff or the volunteers or just people who were part of the circles themselves. Most of the circles I wanted to get to were not actually that busy, and I pretty much got everything I wanted. I made a little spreadsheet prior to going, which I strongly encourage you to do, because if you just like walk around, you will get kind of confused, and you will most likely miss the circle you're looking for, because everything starts to blend together, and circles that you think are big are not actually that big. I'll touch on that in a second. But definitely make a spreadsheet of the circles, and you could either find the information for this on Twitter, or there's a Comiket web catalog that you could look at as well. Additionally, you could purchase the Comiket catalog alongside the regular AM admission wristband at a number of otaku shops around Japan, like Melon Books. Tora no Ana, technically, you can get it web ordered. And to note that with that as well, I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you do want to go to Comiket and you want to get a regular AM wristband, what you want to do, especially if you're not in Japan at the time of purchasing the wristband, you can actually proxy the wristband over, which I ended up doing for one because I bought it as a backup. So I ended up buying a wristband from Melon Books for the AM regular admission, and you could send it to whatever proxy service you want, like Bai or Zen Market or White Rabbit or whatever. Then from there, you can proxy it over to the United States, and then you have your wristband. But since I had the early admission, it was a little bit more tricky because I ended up having to go to Family Mart and typing in like an event code into a machine that they had at the front, which is basically like where most people do printing, but I guess you can also print out tickets and stuff there. It basically printed out a receipt. I gave the receipt to a cashier, and the cashier gave me the actual wristband itself. So there's a couple more loops to jump through if you get the early admission, especially if you're a gaijin, because you need to get there prior to the start of Comiket. Otherwise, they won't have wristbands anymore. Returning back to Comiket, like I said, I got pretty much everything I wanted. I made a spreadsheet. There was a couple of otaku running around, and they actually had like clipboards and stuff with printed spreadsheets, and they were like crossing stuff off as they went, which is probably a better option because otherwise you're looking at your phone and like scrolling and like zooming in awkwardly. So if you want to look like a hardcore Comiket veteran, print out a spreadsheet, put it on a clipboard, and have a pen. You will look like a complete badass, trust me. And of course, stuff that you missed at Comiket could always be purchased at Melon Book. And especially if it's a big circle, you probably don't even need to bother at Comiket because they will have it at Melon Books, unless you want a special bundle that they're doing or you don't want to pay the markup, because Melon Books will mark up doujinshi. It's a decent amount, but it's ultimately not that much. Now, I most notably missed out on the Horizontal World doujinshi, mostly out of choice because I saw that there was a significant line at that point of the day. I didn't necessarily prioritize that circle because I knew that I could always pick up their stuff later. And I would have rather wanted to walk around the venue a little bit more than wait in line for like a half hour. I didn't know how long their line waited. Maybe it was like 5 minutes. So I ended up mostly walking around a lot of the venue after picking up most of my books. Walking around somewhat aimlessly, like there's tables and stuff and it's marked. Eventually you'll get the gist of how things work. Over the course of the trip, I became a master of learning how Japanese alphabetation works. Prior to going, it's been always something that sort of eluded me, like how the kana like lines up in terms of quote-unquote alphabetical order. But thanks to this, as well as shopping for numerous manga series specifically at Mandarake after the fact, I sort of learned that. But of course, you could look at the web catalog online. You could see a map, type in the circle itself, and it will like tell you where exactly on the map it is. Circles, it will state the hall, the row, which is denoted with the particular kana, and then the table, which is all in numerical order. And you can kind of use that to get around. And once you get the gist of it, it will start to make more sense. But in the beginning, I was kind of wandering around and missing and walking past tables that I just didn't know how stuff was working initially. And of course, throughout the entire experience, it was a lot of walking. If you are someone who is not in shape, you better get in shape, otherwise you're going to have a bad time. I mentioned before I walked about 10 miles, probably more after the fact, because after Comiket ended, I still continued to walk. Bring good walking shoes, be prepared to walk a lot, have hydration, have meals, otherwise you will not survive. You will be standing for a lot of time. I basically went the entire day without sitting, and it took a massive toll on my feet. By the end of the event, I was surviving mostly on the power of love and adrenaline, because that katsu sandwich was not doing anything for me. My feet were collapsing, my legs felt numb, and it was insane. And this is coming from someone who, I haven't done it recently, but I am a recreational distance athlete. I will for fun go run 5 miles on the weekend. So I'm someone who is active, and at the end of it, I had a bad time. So just make sure that you are in a decent spot if you want to do a lot of walking at the convention and get as much out of it as you can. Otherwise, you're going to have to try to be efficient and limit the amount of steps you take. It just all ended up sort of becoming a blur. So some general thoughts about the actual content there. I saw at least 3 to 4 circles selling books with obviously AI generated art. Now, which was not really pleasant to see. Like, you looked at it and you could immediately tell it was AI generated art. It wasn't a lot, but I didn't even expect to see one booth, and that's the reason I bring it up. In terms of the actual series and genres that made an appearance there, it was pretty obvious that Love Live was pretty dead. The Blue Archive Invasion is significantly worse than you think. If you think it's bad, it's worse than that. And surprisingly, Idolmaster was still hanging in there. Unfortunately, though, Toho was a bit of a wasteland for boomers, and it wasn't that busy, but it still had its own area, which maybe limited the amount of foot traffic, I guess, or spaced people out enough that it didn't seem as intense. But there still is a decent amount of Toho stuff out there. So now I want to tell a little story about the best moment on my Japan trip and potentially one of the top 5 most memorable moments in my life. So at Comiket 103, I only had one real goal. Everything else was kind of behind me. I tunnel vision went for this circle at the beginning. This is what I was talking about. And this was to visit the booth for Kachikachiyama. Kachikachiyama is a Toho music arrangement circle that's been going on for a decent amount of time now. They've put out a number of singles and CDs. This is their 3rd length album that they were putting out at this particular Comiket. I saw that they were there and I immediately prioritized them. And the reason is because Toho Doujin Ongaku has been one of the most important things that's ever happened to me in my life. One of the bands most pivotal to my love of Doujin Ongaku and just music in general was Shinigiwa Satellite. Shinigiwa Satellite is a band that broke up a while back. Their last album was Dead Weight, and I ended up importing that a little bit after it came out, but it was the first Japanese music CD that I ever purchased, and one of the first things I ever imported for that matter. And I've been a fan of that music since maybe 2017-ish, 2016 or so. A lot of people are really into other bands like Foreground Eclipse and stuff, but for me it was all about Shinigiwa Satellite. They're a post-hardcore, metalcore sort of arrangement thing, but they're similar to Foreground Eclipse, similar enough. But regardless, the band ended up breaking up. As far as I'm aware, I know for sure the main vocalist is Murami Pop. If you know Foreground Eclipse, you know who Murami Pop is. If you've listened to more than 2 Doujin Ongaku CDs, you've probably heard of Murami Pop. And I believe one of the lead instrumentalists from Shinigiwa Satellite went on to form Kachikachiyama, which is a spiritual successor to Shinigiwa Satellite. They initially started off making music similar to Shinigiwa Satellite, and eventually they started to branch off. Now they're dipping their toes into different other subgenres and consistently finding a different voice for the type of music they're making. And it's always fun to listen to whatever they're putting out. And I saw that they were putting out a new album this year. I guess you can call it an album. It's mostly re-recordings as well as some rearrangements of their previous stuff. But it was an album nevertheless. And I knew I had to get there and I had to get it. So that was the first booth I stopped at. It was in the Toho containment area. I ended up circling around the booth 3 times because I didn't know where it was. Eventually, I went back and I'm wait a second. This is where it should be. Oh, wait, it's right here. The booth for Kachikachiyama was so small. Because for people who have seen clips and pictures of Comiket online, it's just a bunch of tables next to each other. And a lot of people share spaces and stuff. So Kachikachiyama had a pile of CDs on the table, someone standing behind a booth, and maybe a little sign in front. But it was significantly smaller than, at least in my head, what I thought it was. I didn't expect them to have something on the wall East New Sound or something. But I expected it to be a little bit bigger, maybe have a bigger sign. Through the power of the internet and my own headcanon and stuff, I always thought of Shinigiwa Satellite and the follow-up band Kachikachiyama to be this big thing, a staple in the Toho Doujin Ongaku community, but it was just there, next to a bunch of other circles, each selling their own CDs and stuff, and I was wow, it's kind of a humbling experience for me as a fan. But I went up to the booth. I was probably one of the first people there. So I walk up to him and there's a lady behind the table cosplaying as Koishi, because the current album that they put out has Koishi on the cover, Satori on the back, and that's kind of the theme they were going for this time. I go up to the booth and I'm can I have the new CD please? This is all in Japanese, of course. Since I was one of the first people there, they had a limited amount of omake CDs, which the omake CDs typically are a thing. Some circles do it, some don't. I have a couple. Some of the circles that put out doujinshi will give out a little pamphlet with a couple pages of extra art or something, or a short story. Sometimes music circles will put out an omaka CD with an extra single or a secret track or something like that. So I ended up getting the unmarked omaka CD as well, since I was probably one of the first people to visit the circle. And then as she's getting the stuff for me, I just start rambling on about, I came all the way from America. I absolutely adore your music. I always listen to whatever you put out at Comiket. And I know this is all falling on deaf ears because I know this is not Murami, and she's just some lady running the booth right now. And she's oh wow, really? And then she proceeds to explain to me that right now the band members, they were running late. They will be there later on in the afternoon, maybe around 12:30 or 1. And if I wanted to, I could come back a little bit later and potentially get an autograph from one of the members. I was for sure, I will definitely be back. Fast forward, I guess, to around 1 o'clock. I had somehow looped myself back around. I intended to come back maybe a little bit later because I didn't know if they were going to be there at 1-ish. I was just roaming around the Toho area. I look and I see the Koishi just waving over to me. I guess she remembers me because I'm probably the only gaijin that she's seen that day. I just start walking back to the booth, and there's this guy there, and I'm assuming it's a guitarist. And I kind of feel bad about this now in retrospect, because I listen to a lot of Doujin Ongaku music, but I really don't know the band members. A lot of it is by design, that they don't really advertise themselves, I guess, or they use nicknames and you don't really know what their face looks like, because a lot of times they blur them out or use like an avatar or something on Twitter. But I'm assuming it was a guitarist. I can't 100% read the signature at all, what he put, but I'm pretty sure he signed it Oyama, which I believe it's the main band member for Kachikachiyama. Multi-instrumentalist, I believe. But anyways, I pull out my CD out of my bag and I give it to him, and I ask him, is like, can you please sign this? And he's like, of course. As he's signing it, I start rambling again, and I'm like, I've been a fan of Kachikachiyama forever, and ever since listening to Shinigiwa Satellite, your band has made music that is so important to me. He's really like surprised by this. He's really thankful, and he gives me a pin. I'm holding it in my hands right now. It's from one of the early Kachikachiyama CDs with Chen on the cover. So I got an exclusive pin that I'm holding in my hands right now. It's probably one of the most important things I got right now, from the convention at least. That I got this pin, a signed CD from a Doujin Ongaku circle that me and like 10 other people care about, I guess. It's just so incredibly important to me, and I think this is what Comiket is all about, honestly. Maybe I didn't do a good job of explaining it, because for me, this is like ultimately what it amounts to, and ultimately why I feel like as a foreigner it's hard to get the full experience of Comiket. The thing is like, if you're a Japanese native, these are people you follow and people you might even talk to. Every year at Comiket you stop by their booth and they will recognize you. They'll be like, oh, it's you again, especially if it's like a small little circle and you're like, yeah, I listen to your stuff every year. So you're almost have this intimate relationship with this artist that you don't really have overseas over here. And this is something that is so like interesting about Comiket, that it's much more of a community than it is a convention or something in the United States, that you get to actually talk to the people in the circle. You get to say stuff and you get to tell them, keep it up, keep up the good work. And I saw that there was a couple of fans that went up to smaller circles and they were like, please continue the hard work and stuff when they bought the book. And it just makes me think that these are people that are buying the books from this circle every single Comiket. They know these people. It's cool. So just some, I guess, general thoughts about the buying experience at Comiket before I start wrapping stuff off. And number one, and most important rule of Comiket, besides bringing water and to wear good walking shoes, is to never shop hungry. If you are hungry and you didn't nut the night before, you will be hungry as heck, dude. You will be like completely ravaging every single circle you pass by. And you don't want to shop horny, dude. Trust me, speaking from experience, you don't want to. You will buy a lot. And I guess another thing that is extremely important to know, especially by someone who is a gaijin that has never been to Comiket, and the majority of media I interact with is like 20 years old that talks about Comiket. Stuff at Comiket and doujinshi at Comiket are significantly more expensive than you think. You watch Genshiken and you see characters buying doujinshi for 100 yen, and in my head I was like, oh, I better have 100 yen coins to buy doujinshi. But when I actually get there, most books are like 5 to 1,000 yen, and I was like, holy crap, this is way more expensive than I thought. I thought I was going to be able to walk up to a circle and give them 300 yen and buy a book, but that's not the case at all. And of course, talking about money, it's cash only. Bring all your coins, bring a ton of cash. If you run out of cash, you would be kind of out of luck. But most books are 1,000 yen plus. And in some other circles, for example, I don't remember the name of the circle, but the artist Gustav, who does some Idolmaster Nita Minami books, they also put out a set, same thing with Orange Maru. And if you buy the set, you're going to be ending up spending a decent amount of money. You will end up getting like a handful of books and maybe like a special bag or something. And in the heat of the moment, I was just buying them, because this is probably like the only time in my life I will end up being able to purchase stuff at Comiket. But I got a decent amount of loot, which was nice. I did mention also prior to this, I believe somewhere like in a video, that if I went to Comiket, I would buy only the random books, right? Or like the stuff that will never be scanned online. I didn't necessarily follow through on this. There was a couple circles I went through that I knew that are not super popular online, that I just ended up buying their books anyways because I'm a fan of them. But there was a couple of other smaller circles that I visited, looked at their books. Actually, in the moment, it was hard for me to justify paying for them, especially when some of these circles were asking for over 500 yen for what is essentially DeviantArt fanfiction. It's interesting and you kind of want to support them, but then you like start flipping through the book and it's got like a really awkward sex scene, and then you flip through more and there's like some mistakes on the line art and stuff. Ooh, I don't want to pay 500 yen for this when I know I could go back down there and purchase another Idolmaster book. There's a couple circles that I kind of wish I did get the books for. Like there was someone who put out one from Amagami, but it was an Ayatsuji book if I remember correctly. But the main reason I didn't get it because it did have some problematic line art in there, as well as I think it was like an NTR book, and the girl getting cheated on was a Kaoru, who is my favorite Amagami girl and one of my top 5 girls in my harem. So I couldn't justify buying that book. And there was also some other artists putting out some interesting stuff, like some Da Capo stuff. Some dude was specifically putting out a comfy little book about key visual arts, specifically some of their older stuff like Air and Canon and stuff. So there was some interesting stuff out there, but I ultimately ended up sticking to the circles that I specifically follow and not really buying too much extra. As a result, I ended up incredibly satisfied with everything I bought. I've already flipped through everything. It's all brilliant, trust me. And also something to note as well is that some of the popular circles and even smaller circles, they will bring a limited amount of old material from a previous year. So, for example, Gustav, who does the Nita Minami books that I enjoy a lot, had a couple books from the previous year and the year before, and I was a big fan of those, so I ended up purchasing the doujinshi from that year as well. And here's somewhat of a complaint I have with Comiket in general, at least the doujinshi area, is that while there are circles generally organized into categories or grouped with the particular series, it's hard to know like what's actually in the books without actually looking through them. For example, like you can wander into the section for Idolmaster, Cinderella Girls, or just Idolmaster in general. You will see like a bunch of Idolmaster books. Sometimes if it's a big enough series, they'll put the characters together, but most of the time it'll be kind of scattered. The problem is that you don't know like what is an NTR book, what is a femdom book, what is a Yuri book. You would have to like look at the cover, make an initial judgment, and then start flipping through it if you don't know the circle who's actually putting out the material itself, which ends up kind of biting me a couple times that I would feel bad about looking through a book and only to realize that it's NTR or something stupid and then like closing it and putting it away. But there was way too many times where there was a cover with really good art and then I open it up and it's something I'm not into. Similarly, like I mentioned with Kachi Kachiyama, there are some circles that you think you're a huge fan of and that are pretty big and they get a bunch of page traffic on Hentai and Sad Panda and stuff, and then you actually show up to the table at Comiket and realize that they're like this little thing, like this little table that only has a handful of books, and you're like, dude, I thought you were much bigger. One of my favorite Precure artists, Sugar BT, or Sugar Bito, I think is how you pronounce his name technically. He was one of the first tables I stopped at, and when I went there were just like this tiny little table in between some other ones, and I was like, dude, I thought this would be the type of stuff that would sell out, but here I am. Like, it's also worth noting that Comiket is not specifically all anime and otaku stuff. Otaku, like ani-ota, anime otaku. There's a lot of doujinshi there, and besides like trains and cars and stuff, there was way more books about alcohol and food or cooking and travel as well that I would have thought. There was sections where like you could leave your aunts or your parents at and they would like look through the cooking books or something. It was kind of interesting. It's also worth mentioning that there was games, but it was pretty small now. I'm assuming that's because a lot of indie devs have started to shift their focus to releasing games just on Steam Greenlight instead of releasing a beta at Comiket or something like that, because it's much easier for a developer to release betas online and stuff or get more recognition there than at Comiket. I didn't see a lot of music either. Most of the music was in the Toho area, but like just in general, I didn't see that much music and I was kind of disappointed by that. Maybe I just completely missed a section. It's also possible that the amount of music has trended downwards, similar to what I mentioned with the game developers, that a lot of these people would just get more traction uploading their stuff online avenues like YouTube, Bandcamp, Spotify, SoundCloud, whatever. So just some funny little stories and asides before I start to wrap things up as well. Probably the most intimidating encounter I had in Japan and probably my entire life was there was this circle and I walked past them a couple times, but I didn't want to go up to it for a specific reason that I'll mention in a second. But I looked at the cover art and I was like, ooh, that cover art is really damn good. It's real good. I want to look at it. But there was an One-chan manning the booth with like this incredibly revealing sweater that had like her cleavage just like spilling out. And I couldn't bring myself to walk up to her and say, can I look at this book, please? And like look at the erotic doujinshi in front of her. It was so intimidating, dude. Do they want to sell books? Like, do they know the type of otaku shopping here? We're Nijigen, guys. We're not going to want to talk to the Sanjigen And a number of circles, not a ton, but a number of circles had like booth babes, or at the very least like girls who would cosplay and handle the money and stuff, which you did see in Genshiken as well. It's obviously an effective tactic to some people, but on the other end of the spectrum, there's a number of people that you're alienating. Like for me, if I didn't end up just out of sheer curiosity towards the end looking at this book, I would have just completely avoided it, specifically because there was a 3D woman standing behind, and I was like, I don't want to talk to her. Not happening. But I ended up flipping through it. It ended up being some like BDSM NTR's rape book or something like that, and I ended up putting it back. But it was pretty wild just having to approach a female. That's not something I expected to do. And it makes me wonder, like, other circles that have a cosplay gal standing behind their table, is there an agency for that? Or do, like, people just ask their friends and the friends are okay with it? Like, I don't know, dude. And on a similar note, I completely avoided the cosplay stuff, so I don't really have anything to say about that. I have zero interest in cosplay, Kill Me Nai, etc. And lastly, just in general, Comiket. Walking between the sections, like once peak hours hit, around 12:30 or noon, it hit, dude. Everybody who was an otaku was in the area, dude. It was crazy. Like, I got bodied so hard, like, I felt a little violated. It was probably the most close contact I've ever had with another human in my life. So the last thing I want to talk about is the quote-unquote true otaku Comiket experience. So this is something I sort of alluded to prior when I mentioned the aspects of the market where like there's like a personal relationship between artist and fan that you don't really get outside of the United States, and it's hard to feel. This was something I was thinking about prior as well. Like in Japan, when you're an otaku over there, you're kind of more involved with the community on a more personal level, because there are a lot of events and stuff that happen for currently airing anime and like concerts and stuff that as a Western fan you can't really engage with it in the same way that a Japanese native could. And this is very evident with Comiket. There are a lot of circles and stuff that you would have significantly benefited from being a native or just knowing the language that much more than being a gaijin who spoke broken Japanese, as well as the fact that like you just didn't live in Japan and be in that area that you can go every year. As a first timer, like it's hard to get the full experience out of it as well, because like I mentioned, there was dudes there with like clipboards that were speed walking between areas that they already knew like the back of their hand, and they were just getting everything immediately with so much efficiency. Ultimately, I had a good time. It made me a little frustrated that I'm not fluent, but like the general trip kind of only served to reinforce that. But at the same time, there was a number of conversations that I had completely in Japanese, specifically at Comiket. Like I was able to flex that Nihongo knowledge that, yeah, I can speak a little Japanese enough to tell these people that like I really appreciate their work as someone who is not necessarily the target audience. Hopefully they were happy that there was people who traveled halfway across the planet because they like their porn so much. Underneath Tokyo Big Sight, rumbling within the labyrinthine walls, is a flame that will forever moeru, regardless of how many circumstances outside and around a subculture attempt to negotiate with it. I saw these guys that were speedwalking with clipboards between every booth that I knew that these people were the people who inspired the mangaka who made Genshiken and Ori-Imo and all these legendary otaku stories. Like, these guys still exist out there. You go to Melon Books the day after Comiket, or even the day of, it's completely packed and sweaty, but completely silent. Everybody is just there for a specific reason. They see the book they want, they grab it off the shelf. It's not just otaku who are teenagers and in their 20s. There's old guys, like legit Oji-san with receding hairlines and more gray hairs than you would think. But they're down there, dude, and they're just buying stuff, and they got like bags of this. If you look at Akihabara and you see that all it is commercialization and tourist traps and modern otaku garbage, just know that beneath the surface just a little bit, in the corners of Melon Books or Mandarake or especially Comiket, within the giant halls that have held the convention for so long, that there are people out there who truly, deeply care about what they're doing. Even if the overall community doesn't necessarily reflect that, there are these people there with this energy within them. And I was just so humbled to be within their ranks this time. I've been training my entire life for this moment. December 31st, 2023 was like the most important day of my life, with no hyperbole. I can remember being a kid just reading doujinshi on N-Hentai and being like, dang, I wonder where these things come from. And realizing that there was this convention and watching this image of Tokyo Big Sight on screen and watching every single anime with otaku as a main theme and as a tag on like AniDB and stuff. So much so that this venue has been burned into my retinas. The image of the Tokyo Big Sight building with its glass exterior, this icon in my head. I know it. I'm so familiar with it, even though I've never been there. And I knew that that's like where my life was culminating to. And then walking away from the convention area, I see people taking pictures of the Tokyo Big Sight building, the 4 upside down triangles, the building that I've seen transform into a mecha in Nurse Witch Komugi-chan. And there's other otaku there just taking pictures of it with me. We know that this was something special that happened this year. It happens 2 times a year, but maybe they don't know if this is the last time and they take a picture to remember it. Because the Comiket means something. And it's hard to see that on the surface. You gotta go underneath. So I want to end this discussion with something scripted. And the majority of this has just been me looking at a couple notes and pictures and remarking about what I thought about Comiket, just my memories. But I want this one to be scripted because I was writing a conclusion to an upcoming essay that I'm working on called An Ode to J-Core. But I felt the conclusion to this was very fitting for this particular discussion about Comiket. As we passed under a tunnel, the window became a mirror, which reflected my seemingly expressionless gaze back. We passed small town after small town, and I couldn't help but see all the cars driving about and houses standing still and wonder what kind of lives these people lived. I couldn't help but notice the railroad crossings in the distance, narrow roads with familiar signage, and small houses with clothes drying outside in the crisp winter air. I wondered if rooms within some of these homes had walls plastered with bishoujo characters, and shelves sagging under the weight of too many manga volumes. Maybe someone in one of these nondescript homes was currently hunched over their computer, completely invested in their own narrative. By the time this thought fully crystallized in my head, the town had already become a distant memory. There were people here in places I never knew, living lives I would only see for a few seconds while the Shinkansen blazed by at 300 kilometers per hour. The window reflected my face back at me as we went underneath another tunnel. The song playing on my headphones was a little obscure doujin EDM track by a producer most people don't know. The track was called Kako no Chi Mirai. The face that looked back at me was 7 years younger. He smiled back at me, and the weight of emotions almost crushed me in that instant. Then we exited the tunnel and another town appeared and disappeared. My favorite song continued to play, and it reminded me of where I started, where I finally managed to get, and the hope of where I could go. It sunk in where I was and what I had experienced over these past couple days. In that moment, I was confident that I finally fulfilled the little dream my 18-year-old self thought was so far away.